The sun was gentle that morning, casting long shadows through the large, regal window panes of Judge Samuel Carter's courtroom. Yet within, a storm brewed under the skin, concealed by the judge's composed demeanor. At 55, Samuel had become synonymous with fairness and steadfast justice in the seaside city of Brighton. But today, as he skimmed the case file of the day's most pressing trial, his heart stumbled upon a name, Michael Mick Livingston. Memories, like surfacing ruins, clouded his professional clarity. Mick, whose laughter once echoed alongside his own in sun-drenched fields and rain-soaked adventures during a bygone childhood, was now the defendant facing a charge as serious as arson with mortal consequences. Samuel recalled the dusty lane back to his old elementary school, where he and Mick made promises of endless friendship. Yet, life diverged their paths. Samuel pursued law, while Mick spiraled into bitterness and desperation. Dread mingled with duty as Samuel entered the courtroom, aware that his objectivity would face its hardest test yet. Could justice still be blind when faced with a friend's life hanging in the balance? This pressing dilemma lurked in the corners of his mind as the trial began. The courtroom was cavernous, echoing the weight of decisions that had been rendered within its ancient walls for decades. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of anxious onlookers and whispered conversations. As people shuffled to their seats, Samuel remained rooted behind a bench that rose imposingly over the room. The smell of varnished oak and old paper filled the air. It was a Monday like any other, but with the added tension that lingered on the skin like persistent humidity. Outside, seagulls cried distantly as people went about their day, blissfully unaware of the reunion unfolding inside. Samuel stood poised, yet inwardly adrift, navigating a thicket of emotions he had not anticipated when he donned his robes that morning. As the bailiff called for order, Mick was escorted in, a weathered visage framed by hair still defiantly russet beneath the courtroom lights. His eyes darted, narrowing slightly as they met Samuel's gaze. There was recognition there, faint and flickering, the faintest glimmer of surprise softening the hard lines of his face. Samuel cleared his throat, striving for an aura of detachment despite the undeniable throbbing beneath his ribcage. The courtroom adjusted its focus to the front, expectant hush stifling the air. "State your name for the record." The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence, precise and unyielding. "Michael Livingston," came the reply, Mick's voice an all too familiar timbre of defiance beneath layers of gravel. Each syllable was a distant echo of childhood summers, a boys daringly sassing their elders with voices not yet tempered by time. The prosecutor pressed forward, outlining the case with swift professionalism. As the charges were addressed, arson, endangerment, potential loss of life, the courtroom swayed between curiosity and condemnation. Samuel's critical ear absorbed each detail, every word woven into a narrative that sought to pin Mick to the crime. Witness accounts, motive, opportunity, each an intricate piece of a damning jigsaw puzzle that encased his old friend in a web Samuel now poured over. His mind flickered back to a time untouched by such burdens. He and Mick, side by side, scraped knees from scaling trees and splashed with mud for make-believe campaigns. They had been inseparable then, until they weren't. The divergence had come as subtly as a whispered secret, set in motion the day a scholarship whisked Samuel away and left Mick behind to bear his family's struggles alone. A piercing voice broke through his reverie, the defense attorney's, a younger man with an earnest face, presenting his counterargument. It was like watching an intricate dance, this skilled back and forth, a performance Samuel had mastered observing from his bench of judgment. Yet today it felt different. Personal. Raw. Samuel stole glances at Mick, whose eyes darted across the room defensively. What had become of him in those lost years? Those years when Samuel had climbed the judicial ladder while Mick had slipped through society's cracks. The trial unfolded, painting a picture of Mick's life that was all too familiar to the judge but horrifyingly new in its depths of despair. Addiction, loss, fleeting brushes with the law. These elements framed a portrait of a man Samuel had barely recognized, sculpted by harsh circumstance and choice and streaked, albeit faintly, with hope. "Does a defendant wish to make a statement at this time?" the prosecutor intoned as the trial's morning drew to a close, peering over bifocals with the scrutiny of hawk. Silence hung in the air, palpable and charged. Mick rose, a weary resignation about him suggestive of a man braced against the tides. "I've not always been a good man," he began, his gaze empty, voice unwavering yet laced with a vulnerability that cut through the silence. "But I'm not a lost cause." His words were simple, embodying a truth Samuel had both imagined and feared, that despite everything, The boy he once knew still existed somewhere amid the man's troubled facade. Could he find the justice that lay uneasily alongside his desire to make it right? It was more than a question of law, but a crossroad of morality and human connection that tested the very fiber of his being. As the echoes of the day's proceedings faded, Samuel withdrew to his chambers, the solitary confinement of thought necessary. The verdict was not yet written, yet Samuel knew he walked a tightrope of emotional conflict, sympathetic memory, and the stern dictates of his role. His heart, once resolute, now whispered with the uncertainty of change that a single trial or a single friend could bring. Yet one thing was certain. Samuel knew, gazing upon the twilight-streaked horizon beyond the windows he'd stared out from countless times before, that justice walked hand in hand with mercy, and both would demand his respect. Therein lay the legacy of a judge who could not ignore the haunting allure of friendship and the immutable call of truth. Shadows of past. The courtroom was a cavernous, solemn place, echoing with a history of justice meted out under its high, arching ceilings. It seemed to inhale the weight of memory and channeled it into the hush that drifted like mist through the wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of anxious spectators. Within those walls, the smell of varnished oak mixed with the musty scent of old case files, and the muted whispers of the day's gathering filled the air, creating a tapestry of anticipation. Judge Samuel Carter, a bastion of fairness and meticulous deliberation, sat poised behind his bench. Yet inside, he was adrift, an unwitting voyager in a sea of emotions he had thought long conquered. Today, he found himself facing an opponent not only of the law but of his own heart, Mick Livingston. It was an inescapable confrontation against the specter of a friendship that had once glowed bright and unburdened by the weight of time's passing. As the bailiff's voice rose to call the court to order, Mick was led in. He appeared older, bearing the weathered visage of a man who had fought many unseen battles. His russet hair, still stubbornly vibrant beneath the glaring overhead lights, framed a face that paradoxically housed both the insolence of his youth and the resignation acquired through hard-lived years. Their eyes met, and for an electric moment, the courtroom shrank to a bubble encompassing just the two of them. Mick's eyes, once a beacon of laughter and daring, now carried the weight of a lifetime etched in the furrows of his brow. There was recognition there, a flickering surprise that softened his otherwise hardened features. It was an acknowledgement of a shared past, tinged with loss and the possibility of redemption. Samuel's stomach twisted with a complexity of emotions he hadn't prepared for when he had donned his robes that morning. The touch of irony did not escape him. Here they both were, two lives that had diverged at a dusty crossroads of childhood, now colliding again within the strict confines of an unforgiving judicial system. "State your name for the record," came the clipped, precise voice of the prosecutor, disrupting the charged silence. Mick spoke with a voice unmistakably familiar, though time had laid gravel-tinged layers over its once boyish defiance. Michael Livingston. Each syllable was a resonance of their shared past, of afternoons once wasted in carefree banter atop schoolyard fences. As the prosecutor began outlining the case, the courtroom swung like a pendulum between curiosity and preconceived judgment, each recount of Mick's alleged crimes a blow against Samuel's objectivity. The charges, arson and potential endangerment of life, were heavy, the evidence laid out like a net cast wide around Mick, each piece tethering him further to the life Samuel had never foreseen for his friend. Samuel's mind tumbled backward, threading through patches of memory now thrown into sharp relief. Simple afternoons etched in sepia tones, he and Mick racing laughter-fueled through fields until they collapsed in heaps of tangled energy. Those halcyon days had ended subtly, with the onset of irreversible change, the arrival of a scholarship for Samuel, the unyielding weight of familial obligations for Mick. Amidst the prosecutor's methodical barrage of facts and conjecture, Samuel could see the tapestry of Mick's life unravel. It was a portrait awk with shadows cast by his societal fall, tracing a jagged line through missed opportunities, addictions taken up like forgotten promises, and the inevitable missteps that left him ensnared in the criminal justice system. The defense attorney, young and earnest, stood firm, crafting counter-narratives with vigor and dexterity, threads of Mick's life unraveling into a narrative that spoke not only of guilt but also of avoidable tragedy. It was a delicate dance, a choreography of assertion and rebuttal, familiar yet jarringly personal under Samuel's watchful eye. Time drifted on like a languorous wave as the courtroom drama unfolded. Mick sat quietly, enduring the back and forth with the air of a soldier bound to face whatever came. What had become of him during those lost years while Samuel had scaled the heights of respectability and justice? What ghosts haunted his steps and where, amid those shadows, lay the friend Samuel had once known. Then a question broke through Samuel's reverie, pulling him back into the imminence of unfolding events. Does a defendant wish to make a statement at this time? The prosecutor's voice came soft yet unyielding, drawing the court's collective attention. A tense stillness enveloped the gathering as eyes turned anew to Mick. He rose, drawing in a breath that bespoke years of hardship worn threadbare. He spoke with a plainness that landed heavy upon attentive ears. "I've not always been a good man," he began, each word weighed with the gravity of past actions. "But I'm not a lost cause." The sincerity of his admission threaded through the room, distilling his existence into a single plea that resonated louder than any barbed defense. A declaration of humanity amid layers of complex failure and a bid for understanding beyond judgment. Samuel listened, his heart heavy with the echoes of a boy's laughter in times untroubled by fate's inexorable drift. Mick's admission was more than the culmination of criminal woes. It was an invitation for connection, a bridge back towards a life derailed and a friendship paused but never truly broken. At the close of proceedings, Samuel withdrew to the solitude of his chambers, the familiar peace now unsettled by a tempest of contemplation. The path to justice was clear yet fraught with a debris of memory and personal history entwined with duty. His inner compass wavered, the certainty that had defined his judgments whispering now with the uncertainty of past and future choice. As twilight edged into being, blotting the sky with dreams of darkening indigo, Samuel gazed out, reflecting upon the legacy he was poised to shape, one where justice must walk hand in hand with mercy. He understood with poignant clarity that Mick was not simply a man before his law, but a friend standing at the crossroads of destiny, whose true verdict would bear the weight of lost years' redemption and newfound hope. The trial stretched into its second week, tension snapping in the air like electric currents. Samuel Carter's dreams were haunted by fragments of Mick's testimony, each word resonating within chambers of guilt and kinship. During his lunch breaks, Samuel often found himself standing before the old church where he and Mick once played hide-and-seek. In those stone facades, time quietly deliberated both men, what they were and what they had become. Each day in court was a fresh tempest of emotion for Samuel. As he handled his gavel with procedural dignity, his eyes would drift to Mick, who sat among the defendants, a solitary figure dwarfed by the courtroom's grandeur. Every glance between them was a silent conversation, echoing words unsaid and promises unkempt. Mick had lost weight since their last encounter. His cheekbones cast shadows upon the pallor of his skin, and every movement he made was with measured carefulness, as if enduring a perpetual winter. Samuel's internal conflict gnawed at his conscience with relentless tenacity. Justice required cool detachment and impartiality, qualities Samuel had cultivated over a distinguished career. Yet each reminder of Mick's present circumstance pierced through those cultivated defenses, revealing the raw, unpolished terrains of his early years. On midweek, as Samuel combed through evidence once more, a dislodged leaflet from the stack of documents fluttered to the floor, a neglected detail about an emergency response report. It highlighted a witness testimony that had initially been dismissed as inconsequential. Veins of doubt crept through Samuel's resolve as he traced the discrepancies with deliberation. This could change everything, he pondered, placing a worn finger to his lips, the measure of truth and recollection tipping precariously. That evening, Samuel found fitful reprieve at his study desk, moonlight spilling like silver over a sea of papers. Abandoning the confines of legal prose, he surrendered to memories uninvited. He remembered the day of his own father's funeral, how Mick had stood by him, silent yet steadfast, offering a slice of companionship during his first brush with irrevocable loss. It had been a touchstone in their friendship, even as life's currents began to pull them in disparate directions. Back in the courtroom the following day, Samuel maintained his poise, though now a weather-worn puzzle piece, fitful with newfound awareness. The irony of his position was palpable. A single decision, steeped in layers of childhood camaraderie and judicial duty, wielded power over Mick's future. At lunchtime, the halls buzzed with the collective anticipation of closure. Lawyers clutched their suitcase handles with eagerness restrained by the deadlock of unresolved justice. Samuel withdrew into his chambers, where the air held different judgments, gossamer remnants of lives weighed and measured, and amid them, the specter of a boyhood entwined with the man he now was. The defense attorney, young and earnest, returned with vigor for one last refutation. Her voice sang with conviction, weaving through Mick's life with a tapestry of context, not excuses, but a plea for understanding. Samuel listened intently, his heart attuned to the rhythm of each argument laid bare. She spoke of Mick as if tracing the strokes of a painting, a narrative marred by loss, opportunity unearthed, and decisions born out of desperation rather than malevolence. Meanwhile, Mick watched the proceedings with a warrior's stoicism, a quiet resilience carved from the hardships he had faced. He seemed a figure caught between worlds, the unforgiving reality of the courtroom and the lingering shadows of his past. After the defense had rested, Samuel called for a short recess. In the lull, he summoned his breath and focus, knowing the moment of truth loomed on the horizon. It was then that Mick unexpectedly approached the bench, penitent yet dignified, seeking a word off record. "Sam," he began, the softness of his voice a whisper against the courtroom's somber acoustics. I don't mean to put this on you. Whatever happens, know that. It is what it is." Samuel met those eyes, now kindled with earnest resolve. "It's not just a case, Mick. It's our lives tangled in more ways than one." His voice was reflective, almost granting more revelation than intended. "But remember, justice is not mine alone to give. In another lifetime, maybe—" Mick's words stopped abruptly, the weight of something unspoken brimming at his lips. "Another lifetime," Samuel agreed solemnly, nodding, aware of the invisible line they now straddled. Here was a man caught between what had been and what might yet become. The afternoon sun slanted through the courtroom windows as they reconvened, gilding Samuel in a light that felt both like a burden and a benediction. He deliberated the obscure details, the intricate threads of consequence culled from years past, and the fractured choices that lay between. What unfolded in Samuel's mind was a revelation. The trial he faced was less about Mick and more about his own capacity to wield justice infused with humanity. "The court finds reasonable doubt must be cast in light of new evidence presented." His voice was firm, though his heart thundered with the enormity of it all. It was both the law working and a testament to their buried friendship reborn under scrutiny. Samuel delivered his remarks with measured calm, the endearing echoes of their shared history mapping every thought. The verdict had yet to finalize in the jurors' hands, but these words stood as a bridge they both had crossed. Samuel realized that not every friendship was meant solely for warm days, but also for trials that tested their true durability and capacity for forgiveness. As the courtroom dispersed for a final deliberation, Samuel sensed an easing within, a realization that justice, though meant to be impartial, was most worthy when entwined with mercy. For in its most exalted form, it spoke not only to punishment but to redemption, to the possibility of starting anew amid life's overgrown paths back to truth. Hashtag echoes of redemption. The trial stretched into its second week, the air in Judge Samuel Carter's courtroom crackling with tension, each breath shared by strangers and acquaintances now tied together by the gravity of justice. Samuel's own nights had become restless, haunted by slivers of mixed testimony, and each memory of those carefree days they shared, as vivid as if time had folded upon itself. Every afternoon, Samuel stood before the weathered stones of the old church. Here, in this sanctuary of forgotten laughter and childhood escapades, echoed the laughter long since silenced by the burdens of adulthood. The court sessions progressed like turbulent tides, sweeping Samuel into depths of uncertainty and self-doubt. Every time he lifted the gavel, he felt the weight of the world pressing down with unyielding force. The courtroom was both a stage and a battlefield, each participant playing a role in the unfolding drama while seeking their own semblance of truth. Samuel's eyes, drawn inadvertently to Mick sitting solemnly among the defendants, engaged in a silent conversation, a dialogue of their own creation shared without spoken word. Mick had changed since Samuel last saw him. The once robust man looked diminished, as if the burdens of life had chiseled away his joys, leaving only shadows of the vigor they once shared. Yet Mick carried himself with quiet dignity, a silent defiance against the chains of his alleged actions. Samuel wrestled with his conscience, balancing the scales between judicial impartiality and personal bias, a tightrope extending further with each hearing. On one brisk afternoon, Samuel perused the stack of documents carelessly breached by a dislodged leaflet that fluttered innocuously to the floor. It was a seemingly minor detail about an emergency response report, initially overlooked, yet now igniting a flicker of potential doubt. A witness account, once dismissed, began to breathe life into an alternate narrative. Samuel's heart quickened as clarity intertwined with chaos, weaving a complex tapestry of truth he was duty-bound to unravel. In the crystalline reflection of moonlight on paper, Samuel revisited memories best left dormant. The night Mick stood beside him at his father's funeral loomed vividly. Back then, Mick was his solid refuge, his presence a balm to raw grief. Those whispers of friendship stormed Samuel's heart, compelling him to explore beyond the surface of what seemed clear-cut in the trial. The next day in court, as arguments unfurled with relentless urgency, Samuel sat back, absorbing the defense attorney's passionate appeals. Young and fervently committed, she sketched Mick's life with intricate strokes of compassion and rationality, seeking understanding rather than exoneration. Her voice resonated with the sympathy of a life misunderstood, echoing the despair of wrong turns and survival in a world painted black and azure. With the defense's final pleas punctuating the courtroom atmosphere, Samuel sought a brief recess. With each tick of the old courtroom clock, anticipation built as if the very air dared to hold its breath. In this pause, Mick approached the bench, his presence both familiar and somber. "Sam," he started softly, a bridge between then and now. His voice was barely more than a sigh, an acknowledgement of their history as well as the present circumstances. "I know what this means for you. It's not fair to—" "Mick, it's not about fairness." "Not now," Samuel interrupted, his tone a confessional blend of brotherly affection and stern duty. "Every decision we've made has brought us here. It's not just you on trial. We're all here testing what we believe in. In another lifetime," maybe Mick hesitated, 1,000 words trapped in the unspoken. Samuel nodded, his gaze unyielding, grounding. "Perhaps, but here we are. Let justice do its work, as it must." Mick's eyes glistened under the courthouse lighting, and for a moment, the courtroom faded, leaving them as two boys under summer skies once more, imagining endless horizons. With the recess over, Mick returned to his seat, while Samuel, now imbued with a burgeoning resolve, resumed his role. As the late afternoon sun descended, painting the room in hues of gold and shadow, the power of choice weighed heavily upon Samuel. Both law and conscience required clarity, an understanding that transcended mere protocol. With calculated precision, the judge addressed the courtroom, knowing his words tethered not just judicial resolution, but also personal truth. "The court finds reasonable doubt must be acknowledged in light of this new evidence," Samuel declared with composed authority, each syllable a weave of law and moral responsibility. His voice was steady, projecting fairness to the masses while his heart thundered with its own silent storm, the realization that sometimes friendship transcended the boundaries of reason. In these moments, Samuel admitted quietly to himself that justice, as much as it was an institution, was alive with human fallibility and grace. The echoes of their friendship and shared lives intertwined in his decision, as they had been entwined through the warp and weft of years past. The courtroom's anticipation fell silent as jurors convened once more to deliberate. Samuel remained, gloves of formality unshed but heart unveiled. This moment transcended law. It was about finding a forgotten bond, embracing complexity, and offering a friend a redemption to rise from past errors into tomorrow's light. Amidst the resonant quiet as people shuffled from the room, Samuel sat suspended in a new avowal, knowing that justice, wielded rightly, could indeed coexist with mercy. In acknowledging everything that Mick represented, Samuel reaffirmed not just a verdict, but also the boundless possibility of human redemption. Here they stood, reconciled not just in title or role, but as bearers of profound understanding, ready to face whatever roads lay before them, together yet apart. The courtroom was awash with tension as the words of the closing arguments echoed off the tall walls, each resonance a reminder of the gravity the day held. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, casting long, somber shadows that seemed to stretch with the weight of fate undecided. Judge Samuel Carter sat silently, his robes a dignified symbol of the authority he struggled to remain impartial within. Inside, his heart was a turbulent sea, churned by every word spoken about Mick, the man, the friend he once knew as a boy, now veiled under the somber cloak of accusations. As the jury prepared to deliberate, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew palpably heavy, charged with expectation and the murmur of hushed conversations. Spectators shifted in their seats, each motion betraying the anticipation they collectively shared. Samuel's gaze swept over the room, briefly catching Mick's eyes. In that brief exchange, there was a flicker of something ancient and untouchable, an understanding that went far beyond the present circumstances. The jury was out. Time crept by with a sluggish, oppressive slowness, marked by the incessant tick-tock of the courtroom clock, each second an eternity of unresolved tension. Samuel leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, transported back to a time when he and Mick were inseparable, their only trials those of youthful mischief. The memory of that day, Mick took the blame for something he hadn't done resurfaced. Samuel had watched his friend stoically accept the punishment, a silent agreement formed between them that had, at the time, only solidified their bond. That act of selfless loyalty weighed now on Samuel's conscience like an unyielding ghost. Was it possible, here in this solemn court, to offer Mick the same unwavering support, to find justice in its truest form? The jury filed back into the room, their expressions inscrutable, yet heavy with the burden of their deliberations. The anticipation thickened, a collective inhale from everyone gathered. Samuel readied himself, the gavel cool against his palm, its weight reminiscent of both an instrument and a symbol of his responsibilities. As the forewoman stood, her eyes meeting Samuel's for the briefest of heartbeats, the world seemed to hold its breath. Her voice was clear, her calm demeanor belying the gravity of the moment. On the charge of arson with intent to cause bodily harm, we find the defendant, Michael Livingston, not guilty. The words hung in the air like a suspended breath finally released. The room seemed to pulse with a sudden shift in emotion, relief from some corners, disbelief and murmurs of dissatisfaction from others. Mick's reaction was muted, a slight bow of his head, but in his eyes was the vibrant spark of something that had been dormant far too long. Samuel felt the tension in his shoulders begin to unravel, a quiet wave of relief blending with the caution of the moment. The delicate balance of justice and mercy had tilted, if only slightly, towards redemption. His decision to highlight the reasonable doubt, that stray detail, the potential exoneration rooted in something so minor yet transformative, had bridged the chasm where law met humanity. After the initial hum of reaction subsided, Mick rose, turning to face Samuel. From his position, the judge allowed a small nod, the briefest acknowledgement of old ties now revived under new skies. Mick approached, hesitant yet propelled by a mix of gratitude and acknowledgement of the trials that lay ahead. The room began to empty, spectators dispersing like leaves caught in a shifting breeze, yet the gravity of moments lingered. Outside the courthouse, late afternoon shadows danced with the soft warmth of the sun, painting the day in vibrant hues of hope and possibility. Mick stood apart from the thinning crowd, waiting with a trepidation distinctly personal. Samuel, still cloaked in his judicial garb, approached, and for a moment, they stood without the barriers of courtroom decorum or social obligation. "Sam, Judge Carter," Mick began, correcting himself as the old, comfortable name slipped through. "Can't, thank you enough." Samuel shook his head, the formality cast away like unnecessary chains. "You don't have to, Mick. This wasn't charity, but justice as it should be, what we owe to each other as fellow human beings." Mick nodded, his eyes brimming with unshed tears born not merely from the verdict, but from an understanding, a renewed chance that Samuel had given not only at that moment but from a friendship rekindled against time's erosion. "Do you remember that summer when we said we'd always have each other's backs?" Mick asked, a slight smile breaking through the lines etched by years of hardship. Samuel chuckled softly, the tension finally unraveling into something familiar and warm. "I do, Mick. Some things never change." As they walked away from the courthouse, their conversation dipped and soared, unburdened by the weight of titles and responsibilities. Their paths, once diverged, now found convergence not just through the resolution of the trial, but by the testament of bonds forged in the fires of childhood adventure and adult reconciliation. In those moments beneath the sprawling sky, Samuel knew that true justice lay not solely in the hands of law, but in the hearts willing to see beyond the surface, to trust in redemption's light. And as they journeyed into the future, strengthened by confrontation and lingering echoes of the past, they did so with the knowledge that justice, finally, had been served in its purest form. Outside the courthouse, late afternoon shadows danced with the sun's soft warmth, painting the day in a vibrant cloak of hope and possibility. Mick stood apart from the thinning crowd, a silhouette against the courthouse steps, waiting with a trepidation uniquely personal. Samuel emerged last, pausing for a moment on the threshold, the accumulated weight of the day slipping from his shoulders like a discarded cloak. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the breeze, gentle against his face, as if nature itself were offering solace for the agonies navigated within those walls. From his vantage, Mick watched the judge, a title that seemed almost too grand, too distant now, Sam, his childhood friend, with a mix of gratitude and bewilderment. Could it really be the same boy who once shared confidences and pledged loyalty bound by shared mischief and secrets whispered in the corners of a sun-drenched world? Samuel descended the steps slowly, each footfall a return to the earth after hours spent detached in judicial contemplation. When he reached the bottom, Mick moved forward, hesitant still, as if checking to ensure this strange reality wouldn't dissolve upon closer inspection. No crowds, no judicial robes, just two men facing each other with years of unspoken dreams and unhealed wounds between them. "Sam, Judge Carter," Mick began, and the correction slipped awkwardly into the space between them. "Can't, thank you enough." Samuel shook his head, a firm yet gentle dismissal of the need for gratitude. "You don't have to, Mick. This wasn't charity, but justice as it should be, what we owe to each other as fellow human beings." Mick nodded, emotions wavering between the levity of relief and the gravity of an unexpected second chance. Those unshed tears, verging dangerously close to the surface, bore not just from the affirming nod of "not guilty" earlier pronounced, but from an understanding deeper and older than the courtroom's formality, acknowledgement of a bond reignited beneath the shadow of lost time. "This feels like a dream," Mick confessed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Back then, I didn't think I'd meet you here like this." "Neither did I," admitted Samuel, his voice edged with the dust of yesteryears. He gestured towards an empty bench beneath a lilac tree lining the courthouse park. "Shall we?" They settled there, side by side, the world ticking quietly around them, now stripped of the pivotal roles of defendant and judge. Here, they could simply be Sam and Mick, reunited under the benevolent embrace of nature, unburdened by the courtroom's stark dichotomies. "Do you remember that summer?" Mick asked, a hint of nostalgia softening his rough exterior, "when we swore we'd always have each other's backs?" Samuel chuckled softly, allowing the solace of memory to relax the lines of his face. "I do, Mick. Some things never change." A gentle quiet enveloped them, memories surfacing like soft ripples in a pond. Samuel glanced at Mick, noting the wear of the world etched upon his friend's features. Yet beneath those etchings lay a resilience forged in harsh times, and the determined glow of enduring spirit. "But what happens now?" Mick's question lingered like smoke in the air, a challenge both looming and intimate. "Where do I start when everything's burnt out?" The words hung softly, a question not for answers but for the strength to forge new directions. Samuel considered him for a moment longer, recalling a shared history that began with sticks and swings and grew rich with untold stories of struggle and survival. "You start where we all do, Mick," Samuel replied, his voice gentle yet firm. "With the basics. Shelter, work, reconnecting with those who've supported and believed in you. Remember, you aren't as alone as you think." Mick nodded slowly, accepting the wisdom as it settled upon his shoulders. "I haven't spoken to my sister in years. Burnt too many bridges, I suppose." "Then let rebuilding be your first step," Samuel encouraged. "Each of those calls you thought you couldn't make, it's time to make them." Courage entwined with apprehension traced Mick's features, a man poised at the brink of redemption, tasked with crafting his fate anew. And Samuel felt, with the clarity of understanding steeped in compassion, that this moment was about more than a legal verdict. It was about renewal, about setting the scales right not in the eyes of law alone, but in the universe's vast mechanisms of balance and truth. The sun began its descent, casting elongated shadows that stitched together the sky and earth, and they rose again from the bench, buoyed now by a renewed sense of purpose, one man freed by justice, the other buoyed by a calling beyond the confines of a courtroom. As they walked away from the courthouse, their conversation dipped and soared, released from the constraints of titles and responsibilities. Their paths, once divided, intersected anew, not just through the resolution of a trial, but through the testament of bonds forged in the fires of childhood adventure and adult reconciliation. In those moments beneath the sprawling sky, Samuel knew that true justice lay not only in the thorough exercise of law, but in the willingness to look beyond titles, beyond records and regrets, into the stories that define their very humanity. And as friends and former brethren voyaged into the heart of a future infused with light and the possibility of redemption, they did so with the knowledge that justice, in its most luminous form, had been served.